A silent road in rural South Carolina, an abandoned car, a life taken too soon. This is the story of Dime Doe, a woman whose tragic murder would lead to one of the most important hate crime convictions in U.S. history. But what really happened to Dime? And why did it take years to get justice? Tonight, we start from the beginning. Who was Dime Doe? Before she became a headline, before she became a symbol of justice, Dime Doe was just a girl full of dreams. Born in South Carolina, she was known for her laughter, her kindness, and her fearless authenticity. She was a proud black transgender woman who refused to hide her truth. But in a world where living openly as your true self can be dangerous, Dime was always aware of the risks. She was part of a loving family and had many friends who admired her confidence and unwavering spirit. Dime lived in a small community where everyone knew each other, but acceptance wasn't always guaranteed. Despite the challenges, she carried herself with grace and refused to be anyone but herself. For her, authenticity was everything, even if it came with a price. For years, black transgender women have faced high levels of violence in the United States. Studies show that they are disproportionately targeted, with many cases never being solved. Dime Doe's story would become part of this tragic pattern. However, her case would also make history. On a cold day in November 2019, Dime Doe was seen for the last time. She was reportedly in the company of a man she trusted, a man who, prosecutors would later argue, had deadly intentions. But what led to that final encounter? And why would someone she knew want her dead? Dime had known Dakwa Lameek Ritter for some time. Their relationship was complicated. Some said they were close. Others said Ritter was keeping secrets. Secrets he didn't want the world to know. Their connection, whatever it may have been, would ultimately lead to her tragic end. That evening, Dime and Ritter were seen together. Witnesses say she got into his car, laughing as she always did. But what happened next remains uncertain. What is known is that hours later, Dime Doe's lifeless body was discovered in a remote area, far from town. The brutality of the scene left no doubt. This was a murder. The question remained: who did it and why? The police began their investigation, but like many cases involving transgender victims, progress was slow. Hate crimes against transgender individuals often face barriers: lack of leads, lack of witnesses willing to speak, and sometimes a lack of urgency. However, this case would not be ignored. An anonymous tip pointed detectives in a shocking direction: Dakwa Lameek Ritter. Ritter wasn't just anyone. He was someone Dime knew personally. Someone who, sources said, had a reason to silence her forever. But could they prove it? And would they be able to bring him to justice in a system that had historically failed people like Dussim? Authorities began gathering evidence. They retraced Dime's last movements, spoke to people who had seen her that night, and examined phone records. As they pieced together the timeline, a disturbing pattern emerged. Ritter had been in contact with Dime in the hours leading up to her death. Messages between them hinted at a secret, something Ritter wanted to keep hidden at all costs. As more details emerged, a grim picture formed. Ritter, it seemed, had been living a double life. There were whispers that he had been involved with Dime, but he was afraid of what would happen if people found out. He was known in his community, and he feared exposure. To some, the motive was clear. He wanted to silence Dime forever. The case was growing stronger, but law enforcement needed more than just suspicion. They needed proof. They needed to connect Ritter directly to the crime. And that's when they found it. A crucial piece of evidence that would change everything. In their search for answers, investigators examined Ritter's car. What they found inside was undeniable, a trace of Dime's blood. The forensic evidence placed her in his vehicle, and it was enough to make an arrest. Ritter was taken into custody and charged with murder. But the fight for justice was far from over. As the case gained attention, activists and community members rallied for justice. The murder of Dame Doe wasn't just another crime, it was part of a larger epidemic of violence against Black transgender women. The stakes were high, and the world was watching. A murder, a suspect, and a community demanding justice. The case of Dime Doe's tragic death was just beginning to unfold. With an arrest made, investigators now had to build a case strong enough to ensure justice would be served. But as they dug deeper, shocking details began to emerge. Details that would shake the courtroom and change history. With forensic evidence linking Dakwa Lameek Ritter to the crime, law enforcement wasted no time in making an arrest. Ritter was taken into custody and charged with murder. The community watched closely as the case unfolded, with many wondering if justice would truly be served. From the beginning, Ritter denied any involvement in Dime's murder. He maintained his innocence, claiming that he had no reason to harm her. But the evidence was telling a different story. Prosecutors knew they had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Ritter had not only killed Dime, but had done so with intent. To do that, they needed more than just forensic evidence. They needed motive. As investigators combed through Dime and Ritter's history, a dark truth began to emerge. Ritter had been living a double life, one that he was desperate to keep hidden. Witnesses came forward, revealing that Ritter had been involved with Dime in a way that contradicted his public persona. In a society that still carried deep-rooted prejudices, Ritter feared exposure. The shame, the fear of being outed, became a deadly force. Messages retrieved from Dime's phone painted a clearer picture. In the days leading up to her death, she and Ritter had been in communication. There were arguments, threats, and a growing tension that suggested something was coming to a head. Investigators believed that Ritter had lured Dime to their final meeting under false pretenses. But once they were alone, the encounter turned violent. Prosecutors theorized that Ritter, terrified of his secret relationship being exposed, made a fatal decision to silence Dime forever. He believed that if she was gone, so was the risk. But he underestimated one thing: the resilience of the community and law enforcement's determination to bring him to justice. While murder charges had been filed, activists and legal experts argued that this was more than just a homicide. It was a hate crime. The violence against Dime Doe was not just personal. It was rooted in a history of discrimination, fear, and transphobia. For the first time in South Carolina history, federal hate crime charges were introduced in a case involving the murder of a Black transgender woman. This was unprecedented. Many saw it as a turning point, a sign that the legal system was beginning to recognize the specific dangers faced by transgender individuals. But proving a hate crime in court is never easy. Prosecutors would need to establish that Dime was killed because of her identity, not just because of Ritter's personal fears. As the trial approached, the nation watched. The moment had arrived. The case that had shaken a community, sparked national outrage, and pushed the justice system to its limits was now in the hands of a jury. The trial of Dagwa Lamik Ritter was set to begin, and the courtroom would soon become the stage for one of the most pivotal legal battles in recent history. But what would unfold inside those four walls would be more shocking than anyone had imagined. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out their case with precision and confidence, painting a grim picture of what had happened to Dime Doe. They argued that this was no random act of violence. It was a deliberate, calculated crime fueled by fear, hate, and an attempt to erase the truth. They told the jury that Dime Doe's murder was not only about silencing a person, but about silencing an identity. They presented text messages, witness testimonies, and forensic evidence that placed Ritter at the crime scene. They emphasized the motive, Ritter's fear of being exposed. This, they said, was not just a crime of passion, it was a crime of prejudice. The defense, however, had a different story to tell. They painted Ritter as a man falsely accused, a victim of circumstance. Their strategy? Create doubt. They suggested that the prosecution's timeline was flawed and that the forensic evidence was inconclusive. They questioned whether the crime was truly premeditated. But then, the defense did something unexpected. They introduced an alternative suspect. They suggested that someone else may have had a reason to harm Dime Doe. They pointed to past conflicts in Dime's life, attempting to shift attention away from Ritter. It was a classic tactic, muddy the waters just enough to make the jury hesitate. The prosecution called on several witnesses who had known both Dime and Ritter. One witness testified that Ritter had openly expressed fear of being outed and had made disturbing comments about what he would do if anyone found out about his secret relationship. Another witness recalled seeing Dime and Ritter together on the night of her disappearance. But the most powerful testimony came from forensic experts. They presented DNA evidence linking Ritter to the crime scene, blood traces in his car, inconsistencies in his alibi, and the digital footprint left behind in text messages. All of it pointed in one direction. Then came a twist no one saw coming. A jailhouse informant came forward, claiming that Ritter had confessed to the murder while in custody. According to the informant, Ritter had admitted that he couldn't let Dime ruin his life. The defense quickly dismissed the informant as unreliable, but the damage had been done. The jury now had more than just forensic evidence. They had words that carried the weight of guilt. Outside the courtroom, the world was watching. News outlets covered the trial extensively, and activists demanded justice, not just for Dime, but for all transgender victims of hate crimes. The case was no longer just about one person. It was about an entire community fighting for recognition and protection under the law. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides delivered their final arguments. The prosecution urged the jury to see the truth, that Dime Doe's murder was an act of hate, that Ritter had killed her to protect his own secrets. They reminded the jury that justice wasn't just about punishing a murderer. It was about setting a precedent. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for reasonable doubt. They reminded the jury that it wasn't enough to suspect guilt. They had to be certain. They pointed out inconsistencies, questioned the credibility of witnesses, and insisted that the case wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed. The courtroom was silent. The jury had reached a verdict. After weeks of testimony, shocking revelations, and emotional pleas for justice, the fate of Dakwa Lamik Ritter was about to be decided. Would the jury see this as a hate crime? Would Dime Doe's name become a symbol of justice? Or would her murder become another statistic in a long history of violence against transgender individuals? The answer was seconds away. The judge entered, and the jury foreperson stood. The words that followed would echo across the nation. Guilty. Ritter was convicted of murder, but the courtroom held its breath as the second charge was read. Guilty of a federal hate crime. A collective wave of emotion swept through the room. Some cried, others cheered, and some simply sat in shock. Justice had been served. But what would it mean for the future? With a guilty verdict secured, the next phase began. Sentencing. The prosecution pushed for the maximum penalty, arguing that Ritter's actions were not just cruel, but carried a message of hate. The defense pleaded for leniency, citing Ritter's difficult past and claiming that the killing was not premeditated. The judge listened, weighed the arguments, and then delivered a sentence that would set a precedent: life in prison with no chance of parole. The verdict sent shockwaves through the nation. Activists hailed it as a landmark ruling, a sign that the legal system was finally recognizing violence against transgender individuals as hate crimes. Vigils were held, speeches were given, and Dime's name became a rallying cry for justice. But while some saw progress, others saw division. Ritter's supporters argued that the hate crime designation was unfair, igniting debates about the complexities of such cases. In South Carolina, where the case had taken place, discussions about transgender rights and hate crime protections intensified. Lawmakers, activists, and legal experts debated what the ruling meant for future cases. Would this verdict lead to stronger protections for marginalized communities, or would it remain an isolated victory? Beyond the courtroom, the impact of Dime Doe's case was undeniable. Legal scholars analyzed the trial, pointing out its significance in setting legal precedent for hate crimes against transgender individuals. Civil rights groups pushed for expanded protections under the law, and media outlets highlighted the dangers transgender individuals face daily. For Dime's family and friends, the trial's outcome brought a sense of closure, but also a reminder of the work still left to do. Justice had been served, but it had come too late for Dime. The hope now was that her case would help prevent future tragedies. The trial had ended, and Dakwa Lamik Ritter was sentenced. But the story of Dime Doe did not end in that courtroom. Instead, it ignited a movement and a call for change that reached beyond the walls of justice. Her name became a symbol, a reminder of the violence transgender individuals face and the need for urgent action. But what exactly changed after the trial, and what still remains the same? The conviction of Ritter on federal hate crime charges was rare and significant. It acknowledged violence against a transgender woman as a hate crime, something that had rarely been recognized in the justice system. Advocates saw this as a step toward broader protections for transgender individuals. Legal analysts debated whether this case would influence future policies. In South Carolina, where the case took place, the impact was immediate. The state had no hate crime law at the time, but this case fueled conversations and demands for legislative change. Activists and civil rights groups pushed for stronger legal protections, urging lawmakers to take action. Nationally, Dime's case became a rallying point for transgender rights. The Human Rights Campaign and other advocacy groups used it to illustrate the urgent need for more inclusive hate crime laws. While federal protections existed, many states still lacked laws that explicitly covered gender identity. Momentum grew, and some states introduced new legislation to expand hate crime protections. However, as with all progress, resistance followed. Critics argued against the expansion of hate crime laws, leading to heated debates about enforcement and impact. Justice for Dime Doe was more than a trial. It was a movement, and that movement continues.